Nothing moves. The mind pauses at a place it cannot cross. No answers arrive. No thoughts advance. You are standing at an edge, where effort no longer works, where knowing falls silent. This quiet feels unsettling, because the mind has reached its limit. Not broken, not defeated, simply finished. Something familiar has stepped away. The habit of grasping, the need to explain, the urge to understand before trusting. This silence is not loss. It is preparation. What filled this space before could only carry you so far. Now it has been gently removed. Remain here, because what approaches next does not come through thought, and leaving now would mean turning back, just before the deeper knowing begins. Lesson 1. The mind was never meant to arrive everywhere. The mind is designed to move. It compares one thing to another, links ideas together, builds understanding step by step. It learns by collecting, sorting, and arranging. This movement gives the mind its sense of purpose. As long as there is something new to grasp, the mind feels alive, useful, productive. It believes progress is made by going further, thinking harder, reaching the next conclusion. But there comes a point where movement itself becomes the limitation. At a certain depth, every new thought begins to resemble the last. The mind turns in circles, refining language without discovering anything truly new. It analyzes, reanalyzes, and explains, yet something essential remains untouched. This is not because the mind is weak or incapable. It is because it has reached the edge of what it was designed to do. The mind was never meant to arrive everywhere. It was meant to take you as far as thought can go, and then stop. This stopping often feels uncomfortable. The mind does not like edges. It is built for continuation. When it reaches a place where thinking no longer expands awareness, it feels useless, restless, even threatened. The familiar tools no longer work. Logic does not open new doors. Reasoning no longer brings relief. The mind interprets this as failure. But this is not failure. It is design. The mind is a vehicle, not the destination. It carries the soul toward understanding, but it cannot enter every terrain. There are regions of reality where movement by thought creates distance rather than closeness. In those regions, arriving requires stillness rather than effort. At this edge, thinking no longer leads forward. It loops. It repeats old insights in refined language. It adds commentary without adding depth. The soul senses this exhaustion before the mind admits it. There is a subtle feeling that continuing to think will not bring clarity, only fatigue. This is the first hint that another mode of knowing exists. A mode that does not move outward. A mode that does not accumulate. A mode that does not arrive by effort. It moves inward. The difficulty is that the mind wants to be in charge of this transition. It wants to understand inward knowing before allowing it. But inward knowing does not reveal itself to control. It appears when control loosens. The mind must reach its own limit honestly before it can step aside. This is why the limit of the mind is often experienced as frustration. The mind feels blocked, not because something is wrong, but because it is standing at a boundary it cannot cross. Boundaries are not punishments. They define where one mode of knowing ends and another begins. The soul recognizes this boundary intuitively. It senses that pushing harder will not help. Something else is required, though it cannot yet be named. This recognition is quiet. It does not arrive as insight. It arrives as a subtle withdrawal of energy from thinking itself. The soul begins to tire of explanation, not because explanation is false, but because it is no longer sufficient. This tiredness is meaningful. It signals readiness. Many people misunderstand this phase and try to revive the mind's authority. They search for new ideas, new interpretations, new language to describe the same depth. But the depth they are approaching cannot be entered through description. Every attempt to name it flattens it. The mind resists this realization because its identity is tied to understanding. To accept its limit feels like disappearance, but the mind is not being erased, it is being placed where it belongs. The limit of the mind humbles without humiliating. It does not destroy intellect, it clarifies its role. The mind learns that it is not the final authority on reality. It is a guide up to a certain point, and then it must yield to something quieter. This yielding is not passive, it is attentive. The mind does not vanish, it becomes still enough to listen. In this stillness, the soul begins to sense meaning without structure. Awareness no longer depends on thought to feel real. This can feel disorienting at first. Without the mind's constant narration, the soul feels exposed. There are no conclusions to lean on, no explanations to reassure. But beneath this exposure is a strange steadiness. The soul realizes it does not collapse when thought pauses. It remains. This realization is subtle but profound. The mind had assumed it was holding everything together. Silence reveals that something deeper has always been present. The limit of the mind is not where knowing ends. It is where knowing changes form. What lies beyond is not confusion, but depth that cannot be approached directly. The mind brings the soul to the door. It cannot open it. Standing at this boundary, the soul is invited into a different relationship with reality, not one based on grasping, but on presence, not one based on explanation, but on recognition. The mind does not disappear here, it rests. And in resting, it allows the soul to encounter what thought cannot reach. The limit of the mind is not an end, but a boundary. Lesson 2: when thinking falls silent, a deeper awareness awakens. When thinking finally slows, the first sensation is not peace, it is exposure. The mind has always filled space with commentary questions, explanations, interpretations, so when that voice softens, the soul feels uncovered. There is nothing to lean on, no familiar narration to reassure. The quiet does not explain itself, it simply remains. This is why the silence can feel unsettling at first. The mind has learned to equate activity with safety. As long as it is thinking, it feels useful. When thought pauses, the mind assumes something essential has stopped. But what has stopped is not awareness. It is the habit of translating everything into words. Beneath the silence of thinking, awareness does not vanish. It sharpens. At first, this sharpening is subtle. The soul begins to notice without naming. Sensations arise and pass without being categorized. Feelings appear without being interpreted. The inner world is still active, but it is no longer narrated. This can feel strange because the soul is accustomed to understanding itself through commentary. Without commentary, experience feels raw and immediate. In the understanding attributed to Ibn Arabi, true perception does not rely on language. Language belongs to the realm of form. Perception belongs to presence. When thought quiets, perception is freed from the need to justify itself. It no longer explains, it simply knows. This knowing is not intellectual. It does not arrive as an idea or a conclusion. It arrives as recognition. The soul senses coherence or dissonance without constructing reasons. It feels alignment without argument. This is why awareness deepens when thinking falls silent. The soul is no longer distracted by the effort to explain itself to itself. The mind often resists this phase because it feels excluded. It is used to being the primary instrument of knowing. When awareness begins to operate without it, the mind feels sidelined. But it is not being dismissed, it is being repositioned. The mind is learning to witness rather than lead. As this shift continues, the the soul notices that silence has texture. It is not empty in the way the mind feared. It is alive with subtle signals. A slight sense of rightness, a quiet sense of unease, a gentle pull toward what fits and away from what does not. These signals do not demand attention. They do not insist. They simply exist. This is where deeper awareness awakens, not as intensity, but as steadiness. The soul becomes less reactive, not numb, but less compelled to respond immediately. Thoughts may still arise, but they no longer dominate the inner landscape. They pass like clouds rather than claiming the sky. Awareness remains present, even as thinking comes and goes. This presence brings a new relationship with uncertainty. Without constant interpretation, the soul can sit with not knowing without panic. Questions no longer demand answers. They rest. The soul realizes that clarity does not always arrive through solving. Sometimes it arrives through staying. Staying with what is present without naming it allows perception to mature. The soul begins to notice patterns not through analysis, but through familiarity. It senses when something belongs and when it does not, without constructing arguments. This discernment is quiet, but reliable. It is not emotional impulse, it is resonance. One of the most noticeable changes at this stage is the way time feels. Without constant thinking, moments stretch. The soul is no longer rushing to extract meaning from experience. It is inhabiting experience directly. This directness feels fuller, even though it is quieter. The soul is closer to what is happening because it is no longer standing outside it, explaining it. This closeness does not overwhelm. It steadies. Awareness becomes spacious rather than crowded. The silence that once felt threatening now feels supportive. It holds experience without compressing it into conclusions. The soul realizes that thinking was never the source of awareness. It was only one expression of it. As awareness deepens, the soul also becomes more honest. Without the buffer of explanation, it cannot disguise misalignment. When something feels wrong, it is felt immediately. When something feels right, it settles without excitement. This honesty is not harsh. It is precise. The soul is no longer negotiating with itself through language. This precision brings humility. The soul recognizes how much of its previous certainty was borrowed from thought rather than lived through awareness. This recognition does not diminish understanding, it deepens it. The soul learns to trust what it perceives without needing to prove it. At this stage, many people try to force insight. They wait for a revelation, a sudden understanding that will explain everything. But deeper awareness does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as stability. The soul becomes harder to shake, not because it has answers, but because it is grounded. This grounding does not depend on belief. It depends on presence. Awareness holds steady even when thoughts fluctuate. The soul realizes it can remain present without constantly narrating its experience. This realization is liberating. The pressure to understand everything eases. Thinking still has a role. It returns when needed, but it no longer claims authority over what is real. Awareness precedes it. Thought follows. When thinking falls silent, the soul does not lose itself. It finds a deeper register of being, one that does not speak loudly, but does not disappear either. This register does not argue. It does not convince. It simply recognizes. And in that recognition, something essential awakens. Silence does not remove knowing. It reveals where knowing was always happening. Lesson 3. The mind seeks control. The soul seeks alignment. As awareness deepens beyond thought, a quiet contrast becomes visible. The mind, by its nature, seeks control. It wants to predict, to manage outcomes, to reduce uncertainty into something graspable. Control gives the mind a sense of safety. As long as it can map the path ahead, it believes it can protect the self from confusion, pain, or loss. This impulse is not wrong. It is how the mind was shaped to function. But the soul does not seek control. It seeks alignment. Alignment is subtler than control. It does not demand certainty. It does not require the future to be known. It is a sense of being rightly placed within the moment that exists now. Where control tightens around possibility, alignment relaxes into coherence. The soul is not asking, "What will happen?" It is sensing, "Does this belong?" At the limit of the mind, control begins to dissolve because the tools that once created certainty no longer work. The mind reaches for explanation, but explanation does not stabilize the inner world anymore. It reaches for prediction, but prediction feels hollow. This loss of control can feel frightening at first because the mind equates control with survival. Without it, the ground feels unstable. Yet beneath that fear, something else is happening. As control loosens, alignment quietly forms. The soul begins to sense reality in a different way. It no longer tries to impose structure on experience. It listens for resonance. Some things feel heavy without clear reason. Others feel light without justification. The soul notices these signals without needing to analyze them. This noticing is not an emotional impulse. It is deeper than preference. It is recognition of fit. In the understanding associated with Ibn Arabi, the soul moves toward what is real through harmony, not domination. Reality does not need to be controlled to be known. It needs to be met. When the soul aligns with what is true, it does not feel powerful. It feels settled. This is why alignment often feels quieter than control. Control announces itself. It demands attention. Alignment does not. It simply holds. The soul rests into a sense of rightness that cannot be explained, but can be trusted. This trust does not come from evidence. It comes from coherence. As this shift unfolds, the soul's relationship with uncertainty changes. Uncertainty no longer feels like danger. It feels like openness. The future is no longer something to conquer. It becomes something to enter with attentiveness. The soul does not need to know what is coming in order to remain steady. This steadiness is important. It marks a departure from fear-based movement. The soul is no longer driven by the need to secure outcomes. It moves according to inner congruence rather than external pressure. This movement may appear slower, but it is more precise. It wastes less energy because it is not resisting what is. The mind may still attempt to regain control. It may produce new strategies, new interpretations, new narratives about letting go. But alignment cannot be manufactured. It emerges naturally when resistance subsides. The soul does not need to be instructed into alignment. It needs space to recognize it. This recognition often arrives through subtle discomfort rather than clarity. The soul notices when something feels off long before it can explain why. It also notices when something feels quietly right without excitement. These sensations guide movement more accurately than control ever could, because they respond to the present rather than imagined futures. Alignment also brings humility. The soul realizes it does not need to manage reality to participate in it meaningfully. This realization softens the inner posture. The soul becomes less defensive, less rigid. It listens more, it reacts less. It does not withdraw from life, but it stops trying to dominate it. One of the quiet outcomes of alignment is simplicity. Decisions feel less complicated, not because options disappear, but because the soul senses what does not belong. There is less internal debate. The soul does not need to persuade itself. It recognizes. This does not mean the mind becomes useless. The mind still serves. It organizes, communicates, and acts when needed, but it no longer claims authority over what is true. It follows alignment rather than trying to create it. Thought becomes an instrument rather than a commander. As alignment strengthens, the soul also becomes more patient. It no longer rushes to resolve tension. It allows processes to unfold. This patience is not passive, it is attentive. The soul remains present without interfering. It trusts that what is real will reveal itself without force. This trust is not blind, it is informed by resonance. The soul has learned to recognize when something fits its depth and when it does not. This recognition protects it from false certainty and premature commitment. Control often commits too early. Alignment waits until coherence forms. At the limit of the mind, the soul learns that safety does not come from control, it comes from congruence. When the soul is aligned, it does not need to defend itself constantly. It can adapt without collapsing. It can respond without panic. This is the deeper shift taking place. The soul is learning to move with reality rather than against it. It is learning that truth does not need to be seized, it needs to be matched. What cannot be controlled can still be known. What cannot be predicted can still be trusted. And in this alignment, the soul begins to experience a freedom that control could never provide. Lesson 4. Not everything real can be understood. As the soul settles into alignment, another truth slowly reveals itself, one that the mind resists at first. Not everything that is real can be understood. The mind has been trained to believe that understanding is the highest form of knowing, that if something cannot be explained, it is incomplete or unsafe. But at this depth, the soul encounters realities that do not open through explanation. They open through presence. Understanding works by reducing. It breaks things into parts, names them, and arranges them into something manageable. This works well in the outer world, where form and function matter. But inner reality does not always survive being reduced. Some truths lose their depth the moment they are explained. They shrink when named. They flatten when analyzed. This realization is unsettling for the mind because it challenges its authority. The mind wants to master reality by understanding it. When it encounters something that refuses mastery, it feels inadequate. But what the mind experiences as inadequacy is actually a boundary of method, not a flaw in capacity. In the inner understanding attributed to Ibn Arabi, reality is layered. Each layer requires a different mode of knowing. What belongs to one layer cannot always be carried into another without distortion. The mind belongs to a layer of form. It understands patterns, relations, and concepts. But essence does not reveal itself through concepts. It reveals itself through direct encounter. The soul begins to sense that insisting on understanding is what creates distance. The more the mind tries to define what is being felt, the more that feeling recedes. The soul notices that when it stops trying to explain, presence deepens. Something becomes clearer, even though nothing has been named. This clarity without explanation feels strange at first. The mind expects clarity to come with conclusions, but this clarity is different. It does not conclude. It settles. The soul feels oriented without knowing why. It senses truth without being able to defend it intellectually. This is uncomfortable for a mind trained to justify every conviction. Yet this discomfort carries a quiet relief. The soul no longer has to translate every experience into language to validate it. It is allowed to know without proof. This permission changes the inner posture. The soul becomes less tense, less guarded. It no longer feels responsible for turning every experience into knowledge. This is where humility naturally emerges, not as self-doubt, but as proportion. The mind recognizes that its reach is limited and that this limitation does not diminish reality, it preserves it. Some things remain vast precisely because they cannot be fully understood. The soul begins to respect this vastness rather than trying to conquer it. The demand to understand everything often comes from fear. Fear of being wrong, fear of being lost, fear of surrendering control. When the soul learns that not understanding does not equal danger, fear loosens its grip. The soul becomes more at ease with mystery. Mystery stops feeling like absence and begins to feel like depth. This shift also changes how the soul relates to certainty. Certainty no longer feels necessary for stability. The soul can rest without answers. It no longer equates knowing with safety. Safety is found in alignment, not explanation. The soul senses that it is held by something ordered, even if that order cannot be fully mapped. Not understanding everything also frees the soul from arrogance. The mind no longer assumes it can contain reality within its frameworks. This humility is not humiliation, it is liberation. The soul is no longer burdened with the task of mastering what was never meant to be mastered. This freedom allows experience to be lived more fully. Without the pressure to interpret, the soul can remain present. It listens more deeply, it observes without interrupting. Life feels less fragmented because it is no longer being constantly analyzed into pieces. At this depth, the soul realizes that understanding is not the opposite of ignorance. It is one mode among others. There is also knowing through being, knowing through resonance, knowing through presence. These forms of knowing do not compete with the mind. They complement it. The mind still has its role, but it no longer claims dominance. This realization reshapes how the soul approaches truth. Truth is no longer something to be captured, it is something to be approached with reverence. The soul learns to stand before what it cannot fully understand without needing to turn away or explain it away. This stance brings steadiness. The soul becomes less reactive to uncertainty. It does not rush to fill gaps with assumptions. It allows space for things to reveal themselves gradually. This patience is not passive, it is attentive. The soul remains engaged without forcing outcomes. Not everything real can be understood, but everything real can be encountered at the level appropriate to it. This understanding relieves the mind of a burden it was never meant to carry. It allows the soul to remain open without anxiety. The mind learns its proper place not as a ruler of reality, but as a participant within it. It becomes a translator when translation is possible, and a witness when it is not. This balance brings harmony to the inner world. Some truths ask to be lived, not solved. And in allowing them to be lived, the soul discovers a depth that explanation could never reach. Lesson 5. The heart knows without speaking. As the soul accepts that not everything real can be understood, another center of knowing begins to emerge. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not argue for attention. It has been present all along, quietly observing beneath the activity of the mind. This is the heart's way of knowing, subtle, immediate, and silent. The heart does not think its way toward truth. It recognizes it. This recognition does not arrive as a conclusion, it arrives as a sense of fit. Something feels settled, or it does not. Something feels coherent, or it does not. The heart does not require explanation to know the difference. Its knowing is not emotional impulse, nor is it instinct in the ordinary sense. It is a form of awareness that responds to essence rather than appearance. At first, this can feel unreliable to a mind trained to trust only what can be explained. The heart's knowing offers no proof. It cannot be defended easily. It does not present reasons. This lack of argument makes the mind uneasy. But the heart is not trying to convince the mind. It is orienting the soul. In the understanding attributed to Ibn Arabi, the heart is not merely a place of emotion, it is a locus of perception. It receives meanings directly, without passing them through analysis. When the mind reaches its limit and grows quiet, the heart's perception becomes audible not as sound, but as clarity. This clarity is gentle. It does not overwhelm. It does not demand immediate action. It simply rests. The soul senses when something aligns with its depth and when it does not, without needing to justify that sensing. This is why the heart's knowing often feels calm. It is not reactive. It does not rush. One of the first signs that the heart has begun to lead is a change in inner noise. The soul argues less with itself. Decisions feel less dramatic. There is less internal debate, not because choices have become easy, but because the soul is no longer split between competing narratives. The heart does not multiply possibilities. It recognizes coherence. This recognition can be unsettling at first because it bypasses familiar processes. The mind wants to weigh options, consider outcomes, and anticipate consequences. The heart simply knows what belongs. It does not explain how it knows. It does not need to. This can feel like stepping onto ground you cannot see, yet somehow trust. Trust here does not come from certainty. It comes from resonance. When the heart recognizes something true, the soul feels a quiet steadiness. There is no excitement, no urgency, no need to persuade. Knowing feels complete, even without language. This completeness is what allows the soul to rest. As the heart's knowing becomes more familiar, the soul also becomes more sensitive to misalignment. Things that once seemed acceptable now feel heavy. Situations that once felt neutral now create subtle discomfort. This is not judgment, it is attunement. The heart responds to depth, not habit. This sensitivity is not meant to isolate the soul from the world. It is meant to refine how the soul participates in it. The heart does not withdraw from life. It engages more honestly. It stops tolerating what dulls awareness. It gravitates toward what sustains coherence. The heart's knowing also reshapes how the soul relates to silence. Silence no longer feels empty. It feels communicative. The soul notices that in quiet moments, the heart's perception becomes clearer. Not because something new is added, but because interference is reduced. The heart has always been speaking. The mind was simply too loud to hear it. This shift does not eliminate thought. Thought remains useful. It organizes, communicates, and acts. But it no longer leads blindly. It listens. It takes direction from the heart's recognition. The relationship between mind and heart becomes cooperative rather than competitive. The soul learns that the heart's knowing is consistent. It does not fluctuate wildly. It does not contradict itself often. It may be quiet, but it is reliable. This reliability builds confidence, not the confidence of certainty, but the confidence of alignment. The heart also knows when to remain silent. It does not force clarity when the soul is not ready to act. It allows time to do its work. This patience is one of the heart's deepest qualities. It understands that not every truth needs immediate expression. As the soul becomes accustomed to this form of knowing, life feels less fragmented. Decisions arise from a unified center rather than competing impulses. The soul moves more slowly, but more precisely. There is less regret, not because choices are perfect, but because they are coherent with inner truth. The deepest knowing does not shout. It does not persuade. It does not demand agreement. It rests quietly, waiting to be trusted. When the heart leads without speaking, the soul discovers that it has been guided all along, just not in the language it expected. Lesson 6. What lies beyond the mind is not darkness, but depth. When the soul approaches the limit of the mind, it often imagines what lies beyond as emptiness, confusion, or loss of direction. The mind has taught it to fear what cannot be named. Anything that resists explanation is assumed to be unclear, unsafe, or incomplete. But when the soul actually rests beyond thought, it discovers something entirely different. What lies beyond the mind is not darkness, it is deep. Depth does not announce itself the way ideas do. It does not arrive with clarity that can be summarized. It settles, it holds. It surrounds awareness rather than standing in front of it. The soul realizes that what it feared was not absence, but unfamiliar presence, a presence that does not speak in words, yet does not withdraw either. At first, this depth feels vast. Without the boundaries created by thought, experience expands. The soul is no longer confined by explanations that reduce reality to manageable pieces. This expansion can feel overwhelming until the soul learns that it is not required to grasp the depth. It is only required to rest within it. In the inner understanding associated with Ibn Arabi, depth is not something the mind penetrates. It is something the soul enters by yielding. The moment the soul stops trying to see clearly through thought, clarity appears in a different form. Not as answers, but as stability. The soul feels held by something ordered, even though it cannot map that order. This holding is subtle. It does not remove uncertainty. It changes the soul's relationship to it. Uncertainty no longer feels like danger. It feels like openness. The soul senses that not knowing everything does not mean being lost. It means being inside a reality that is larger than the mind's reach. One of the first signs of this depth is a change in urgency. Life no longer feels like a problem to be solved quickly. The soul becomes patient without forcing itself to be patient. Time feels less pressurized. Moments feel fuller. The soul does not rush to escape experience. It inhabits it. This habitation brings a quiet steadiness. The soul no longer swings between confidence and doubt based on thought. It rests in a deeper register that remains present regardless of mental activity. Thoughts may come and go, but the depth remains unchanged. The soul realizes that it does not disappear when thinking stops. It becomes more itself. This realization softens fear at its root. Much fear is born from the belief that without control or explanation, the self will collapse. Depth reveals that the self is not upheld by thought. It is upheld by something more fundamental. The soul experiences continuity without narration. In this depth, the mind finds its rightful place. It still functions, but it no longer dominates. It becomes a surface movement within a much larger field. When needed, it acts. When not needed, it rests. The soul does not identify with thought as strongly. It watches thought arise and pass without anxiety. Another quality of depth is humility, not the humility of self-diminishment, but the humility of proportion. The soul senses that it is part of something vast and meaningful, and that it does not need to contain that vastness to belong to it. This humility brings peace. The burden of self-management lightens. Depth also brings a different kind of trust. Not trust in outcomes, but trust in process. The soul no longer needs to know where everything is going. It trusts that it is being carried by an order that does not require its constant supervision. This trust is quiet, unshakable, and free of excitement. As the soul becomes familiar with depth, life feels simpler without becoming shallow. Actions arise naturally. Responses feel proportionate. There is less inner conflict because the soul is no longer torn between competing explanations. It moves from coherence rather than compulsion. This depth does not remove the soul from the world. It allows the soul to participate without being consumed. Joy is felt without clinging. Pain is felt without collapse. Experiences pass through awareness without defining it. The soul is no longer constantly trying to extract meaning from everything. Meaning reveals itself when needed. What once felt like the end of understanding reveals itself as the beginning of grounded being. The mind had reached its limit, not to be silenced forever, but to be freed from a responsibility it could never fulfill alone. Beyond thought, the soul does not lose itself, it finds its ground. Depth does not answer questions. It steadies the one who asks them. And in that steadiness, the soul discovers that what it feared was not emptiness at all, but a quieter, truer way of being present. The mind did its work faithfully. It carried you as far as it could. What followed was not confusion, but invitation. Not loss, but a widening of ground beneath your feet. You were not asked to abandon thinking, only to stop letting it decide the limits of truth. What remains now is quieter, steadier, and harder to describe. A knowing that does not argue, a depth that does not rush, a presence that does not need to be explained to exist. Carry this awareness gently back into life. Let the mind serve where it belongs. Let the heart recognize what thought cannot reach. And remember, reaching the limit was never the end. It was where something deeper finally had room to begin.